We know we're not the most loved institution in the country, but we believe we play quite a meaningful role in our public finances, but also in our economy. So thank you very much for the free lunch. I have to declare the lunch, being from SARS, we can't accept any gifts. So I'm declaring the lunch, and hopefully I can do some work to deserve it. I don't know, did anyone here perhaps look at MoneyWeb today? Or discuss any MoneyWeb articles in the sessions prior to this one? I thought and this is not an attack on the media, I know I'm an official of government, so I don't want to be seen to be intimidating you or bashing the media. But this is what someone wrote. I recently interviewed several, and there my screensaver goes on. My apologies. He says, I recently interviewed several graduates for possible employment at MoneyWeb. I was dumbstruck where not a single one could answer the question, who is the Minister of Finance? That is not from 5 from the top journalism and media studies students of leading and respected South African institutions. These include, unfortunately, Wits, the University of Pretoria, Tshwane TUT, and Cape Peninsula University of Technology, where I studied. The 5 were amongst 8 candidates who were invited for interviews for 3 internship positions at MoneyWeb. They were carefully selected from more than 300 applicants, and the selection was based purely on their academic performance. Only 5 were interviewed, as 3 didn't bother to pitch. These potential interns were around 23 years old, and all scored at least a B in matric and 65% plus for the respective bachelor degrees. The one candidate 6 A's in matric, another passed majority of subjects with distinction in the journalism course. During the interviews, the 5 were all emotional about their dreams of becoming leading journalists. They all claimed to read News 24 MoneyWeb Business Day on their phones every single day. This made their embarrassment even greater when they could not answer a very simple question, who is the Minister of Finance? One confidently replied, Gillian Marcus. While the other, after looking at the ceiling for nearly 15 seconds, muttered, it's that woman. Isn't it Marcus? The rest merely mumbled, I don't know. I'll leave it there. This was by Ryk van Niekerk, a good friend of mine and the editor of MoneyWeb. So, I'm not the one saying these things, but I think, yeah, we work with journalists on a daily basis. We try and be as professional, responsive, and transparent as possible, because ultimately the institution we represent collects public money, your parents' money, your future earnings, possibly, and another organ of what goes into the National Revenue Fund, another organ of our Ministry of Finance and National Treasury allocates money. So we take our duty very seriously, our duty to citizens of this country, to taxpayers, to be as efficient, as professional as possible, and as transparent as possible in our dealings and how we do our business. Let's start with the budget. In February every year, both Marika and I, we go down to Cape Town. The budget normally is on a Wednesday, so we go the weekend before. Then we assist our colleagues in National Treasury and other institutions of the Ministry of Finance with the preparations for the budget. That includes printing a whole set of documents, one of which I brought with. This is the budget review. There's a thicker one called the Estimates of National Expenditure. There's the budget speech itself, and any additional information that would accompany the budget process. So we go down the Saturday, we work through the weekend, all in preparation for Wednesday. Wednesday is our big day, and I think you were there this year. We have a media lockup where about 80 to 120 journalists come in. They are accredited by us. They come in at 6 o'clock in the morning, so we're up at 4, we're at Parliament by 5, and we give them all the budget information, which is more than 1,000 pages of text, typed, printed, prepared. The idea is to give people to be as transparent as possible with how government spends and allocates public money, but also to give the media the chance to have sufficient time in going through them. We try and get our officials to you within the lockup situation. There's a media briefing by the Minister, the Deputy Minister, the DG of Treasury, the SARS Commissioner, and sometimes the Reserve Bank Governor, to talk about how much money SARS thinks it will collect and how government intends to spend it, and on what programs and what policy decisions inform those expenditure allocations. So basically, those highlights in the budget are grouped. It looks at the economy, the domestic economy, the growth rates that we expect for this year. In February, it was 2.7%. We believe it may increase to 3.5 next year and 3.8 in 2015. As everyone knows, looking forward and doing economic forecasts looking forward is a very difficult exercise. That GDP growth figure of 2.7% is a consensus figure that we come to agreement between Treasury, SARS, the Reserve Bank. And I saw on the YouTube archives of previous workshops in previous years, my colleague Andrew Donaldson from Treasury was here 1 year. And he would speak more to the numbers, the public financing and the economic modeling that we use to get to these estimates. But in a nutshell, that's the budget framework. SARS, in terms of the target that the minister set for us, we must collect 989 billion rands this year of revenue. On the expenditure side, National Treasury will allocate more than R1 trillion on expenditure. So there's a shortfall. In February, under the heading budget framework, we expected that deficit or the shortfall to be 5.2%. But because revenue collection was stronger by the end of March this year, that 4.2, together with underspending by government, came in. That figure is now reduced. It stands at 4.6% for this year. So we're far better off than many other economies around the world of similar size. And a big motivating factor for that is that we have a strong and functional revenue system. And that's really a credit to everyone in this country, because everyone contributes to the tax base in one way or another. But I'll come back to that last point. That is the macroeconomic forecast. We believe, where it says GDP at current prices in rand billions, that would be what the expectation is. The total value of GDP for the year would be somewhere around 3.4 trillion. Those are Treasury estimates again. That's the team. They work together on the budget, and I'm somewhere there at the back. That's when we meet the president shortly after the minister delivers the budget. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy basically says, this is your envelope with all the revenue that SARS collected. This is what I can spend with that envelope without creating too much debt for myself. So the fiscal principles: counter-cyclicality, debt sustainability, and what we call intergenerational fairness. Counter-cyclicality basically says that in 2009, our economy went into recession. The technical definition of a recession is when the financial year is divided into 4 quarters. You go into recession where you have 2 successive quarters of negative growth. So when the current minister became Minister of Finance in May 2009, and the current administration came into office, we entered into a recession for the first time in many, many decades because of what happened on Wall Street and in Europe. That year, about 70 billion rands of revenue was wiped off our books, which we couldn't anticipate and plan for. So counter-cyclicality says, even if my economy goes into recession, I will not stop spending. And that's the main difference between us and European economies, who are now in trouble. They introduced something called austerity measures, which says we're cutting back on public expenditure in order to curtail debt. We had the fiscal space to say, for years 2, 3, and 4 looking forward, we will continue to spend, but we will reprioritize our spending to infrastructure so that it stimulates economic growth. If government pulled the plug on public finances and introduced harsh austerity measures, there would be nothing that would have stimulated our economy to regain its growth momentum. So that's the first principle. Debt sustainability, basically says, and the DG in Treasury says to me that this year we'll be paying about 150 billion rands on public debt and the debt service costs on that 4.6% budget deficit. So that's money we had to borrow, and the interest we pay on the debt comes to about 150 billion. Intergenerational fairness says this administration cannot expect you and your children to pay off debt for the rest of your working lives by spending irresponsibly. So it must be contained, it must be sustainable, and it must be fair to future generations. So by the time you enter the labor market, we can't have a budget deficit of 10%. You will carry that burden and generations after you. So that is what intergenerational fairness means. And those three pillars are how the fiscal policy would be determined. That basically shows you the gray line that says revenue. If you look at 2009-10, that's a sharp fall in revenue by about 70 billion because of the financial crisis. The red line is what government spends. And as you can see, the counter-cyclicality stance, expenditure was maintained upwards in order to maintain a growth momentum in our economy. That's not very clear, and that's going to get me in trouble at home now. That's my daughter, our daughter. Her name is Mia. She's 9 months old now. What she has there in her hand is the budget review. For some reason, she really likes that document, maybe because it's bright red. But I wanted to show you that related to my introductory MoneyWeb article. She likes to play with these documents. She can't read it, but what we found, and of many of the things that I talked about now, is contained in this budget review. And if we look at the daily questions we get in the media unit at SARS, much of that information is published in the public domain. It's available, it's accessible. SARS website, Treasury websites. We would love to make these available to your class if ever you need any information on public financing. But that's the kind of questions we get almost on a daily basis from journalists working in newsrooms now. So the second bullet point, this is a question to us during the course of this week. I would also appreciate a broad explanation of what taxes are used for. I mean, it's in here. We give it to everyone in February. We try and communicate it as extensively as possible on talk shows and forums in public. So I didn't want to name the journalist, but that's the kind of really frustrating areas where you think, don't people read? Didn't they watch the budget speech? This is now with the launch of our tax season. So the next question, does the performance of the rand affect how many people are taxed by any chance? Not really relevant to SARS, but it shows a high level of ignorance about financial reporting. That's example number one. Example number two, the rate of employment and the revenue target that may be relevant. Social grants impacting negative on revenue. Again, all of that, chapter 6, I told the journalists, outlines what we spend on social grants, what the policy position is, our projections going forward. It has very little to do with the revenue we collect, and so on. And so my appeal to you would be, a lot of information is in the public domain. Please equip yourself through it. If my friend Rake would offer me a job tomorrow at MoneyWeb to write finance or about the markets, the first thing I would need to do is to learn how to read a balance sheet. So that when I do the announcement of results by a listed company, I can know when they are talking nonsense and what is the truth. It's so easy to just spin people a lie, and they fall for it, which is something as a principled position we try and avoid. We try and be transparent, motivate, and give proof of what we say and put into the public domain. We are now in the period of the year. On Monday, we had a launch with the Minister of Finance of the tax season for 2013. It's basically the period of the year where most working people in this country submit an income tax return to SARS, declaring their income for the year. And it's one of the biggest direct engagements. About 5.6 million people interacted with SARS, individuals in this country, had some interaction with SARS last year. Either they came to the office to submit a tax return, they used the internet, e-filing, they used an intermediary like a tax practitioner to submit the return. But we use this to tell us what the culture of compliance or the prevailing trends in compliance, what does it look like in the country? For us, it looks very positive. Every year we see strong growth in the tax base, which we see in the number of individuals who come on register, who submit their tax returns on time. Last year by the deadline, there was a 16.4% increase. Importantly, the second last point, 646,000 new taxpayers were registered. We believe a significant portion of that new entrance into the job market, even though our levels of economic growth is muted or are muted, and even though we experienced a lot of job losses, particularly in the mining sector during the course of last year. There is some growth, it's small growth, but it's a positive indicator. And of course, the last point, we were able to give people tax refunds, 14.5 billion. And that's a direct contribution to household income. If you can claim expenses that's allowable in terms of the law, we give you a refund, you have additional cash to spend, even if it's on a once-off, one monthly basis. Collectively, that's our injection into household capability, 14.5 billion. That's the minister on Monday with the deputy minister next to him, meeting taxpayers at our office. To talk to people, how do you experience SARS? Are you having problems? Are they helping you? Are they efficient? Are they professional? And that's really Mr. Pravin Gordhan. I've worked with him for a number of years, and that's his great passion. It certainly was when he was the SARS commissioner, to be able to talk to all audiences like yourselves, working people, lower income earners, higher income earners, about the country, our economic prospects, but also your personal experience. How do you perceive this government? How do you perceive an administration like SARS? Because in some way or another, at some point in your life, you'll have to interact with us. We want to ensure that we take a lot of the mystique, the anxiety out of the process, that our staff understands we are a revenue administration in the service of the people of this country, as I said earlier. And he uses opportunities like this to talk to people, get their views, and come back to us to say where we're failing the public. So he's a very tough taskmaster. The success story of revenue in this country in relative terms would be shown there. In 94-95, total revenue collected by SARS, 113 billion. We've come a long way. By the end of March this year, the last figure there, 2012-13, revenue collected 814 billion. So you can see the growth there over the last 19 years or so of how we were able to build a growing tax system, and one that is increasingly capable of funding government's expenditure needs. The percentages of growth every year would be the last column. If you add all of those figures up, it says to us what the economists would call compound annual growth. So on average growth per year for that period. Just before I come there, if you look at 2009-10, the growth percentage is a negative one, minus 4.2. And that's the effect of the global financial crisis that hit us, where we went into decline, where 70 billion of revenue that you projected for the year, because of global conditions, wiped off your books, and your budget deficit increases. So we're still recovering from that point in terms of revenue. But growth has been phenomenal at 11.6% compound annual growth for the whole 19-year period. And the main driver of revenue collection in an economy like ours is GDP growth, that 2.7% figure we started with. And the minister calculates the target that he thinks SARS should collect based on the GDP growth figure. Now, our economy has never grown. The lowest figure there in the positive growth area is 7.3%. Our economy has never grown at 7.3% during that period. The highest levels of growth were touched 4 or were slightly above 4% the period 2006 to 2008 when our economy really grew strongly. Despite lower GDP growth figures, your tax revenue grew exponentially higher. And that again, it's not as much a credit to SARS, but to South Africa, to our collective efforts to build the right levels of compliance. We're still not there. We still believe there's lots of areas of arbitrage and avoidance and so on. But we believe there's a firm basis from which to proceed from going into the future. And that's why we're confident about our future growth prospects for our economy. Because we've proven that even during cycles where economic activity declines, you still have a revenue system that can deliver revenue, and it shelters you against the worst shocks of global contagion and the international developments. Revenue collection, that's a breakdown of what we achieved by the end of March. 814 we collected. It's an increase of 71 billion over the previous year. Then the biggest 3 tax types that drive revenue collection: personal income tax, last financial year 276 billion, corporate income tax, that's from companies, 161 billion, and value added tax, 215 billion. And if there's any major economic shocks and it has an adverse impact on any of those 3 tax types, then we're in trouble. So what we saw last year was that after September and the tragedy at Marikana, there were protracted labor unrest in the platinum sector. Huge job losses. Our corporate income tax collections were lower by about 11 billion. And that's a direct result of the labor situation that started in Marikana and expanded elsewhere. And I think that's sort of brought an urgency in broader government's realization and the current emphasis for mining companies, for labor, for government to come together, negotiate an accord and an agreement, because we need sustainability there. Any investor would tell you they would want sustainability, predictability in policy, in the laws of a country, and the kind of uncertainty and unrest we saw last year, it's very bad for our economy. And we always see it, revenue, it has a lag effect on revenue. You always see it later. So by March, we had 11 billion less in corporate income taxes because of events that happened in September. So I think good work is being done, led by the Deputy President, and hopefully it can have a positive outcome for the mining industry. That's a breakdown of the taxes we collect, which is just technical information. I don't want to go into it too much. Those statistics, they tell you the composition of our tax base. In other words, how many registered entities there are who contribute to the 898 billion that we will collect this year. So we start with personal income tax. There are about 13.7 million working individuals who are on register as at the end of March this year. Not all of them have to submit an income tax return. About 4.5 to 5 million do. The rest of them earn under the threshold. They are lower income workers, and we already have their tax and income information from their employers. And the tax season, the photos we looked at earlier, is really aimed at that segment of the tax base, which is to say most working South Africans earning a salary from one company or one employer. If you're above this threshold, come and submit your tax return. We want to see if what your employer and what you declared can be matched against the data we have. If there's a mismatch, you owe SARS outstanding tax or SARS owes you a refund. That's the equation we work in. The second category is corporate income tax, companies. So 2.03 million companies registered for CIT. About 800,000 of them have to submit a tax return. The red block, VAT, value added tax. VAT is a consumption-based tax. I'm sure all of you know. If you buy a bottle of water or most items in a shop, 14% VAT is levied. Then import VAT and customs duties, that's for companies importing things into the country, and there's certain duties that they must pay. That's another indication of the tax base. The orange block, personal income tax, then corporate income tax and VAT, the big three. The point we often make, and which is often, well, this is used by politicians a lot, is that 5 or 6 million people pay tax in this country. They look at how many people submit a tax return, and the argument is made, but this 5 or 6 million people basically carry a population of 50 million people. And we say, maybe you're right to an extent, but remember, all of us, when we buy this bottle of water, we pay VAT. When we fill our cars with petrol, we pay the fuel levy. When we purchase your pair of imported designer jeans, you probably pay for customs duties on that item. So directly or indirectly, most consumers in the country, whether they are working or not, whether they are wealthy or poor, make some contribution to the tax base. And politically, it's an argument that seems to be forgotten very often because people want to make certain policy positions that says we have a welfare state, only a certain racial segment of the population pay tax and carrying everyone else. But that's the total picture we believe, and we have a different approach of who contributes. And the argument is always, if I, for us at least, if I'm a low income earner and my salary is 1,000 Rand for the month versus my neighbor who earns 10,000 Rand a month, both of us will pay 14% on this bottle of water. And the 14% would affect me proportionally much more than the one earning 10,000 Rand. So there must be fairness to the argument, but I'll leave that for your consideration. Tax compliance, we still believe, as I said earlier, there's some room for growth and improvement. What we did in 2012, we went to look at our tax system and our tax base, and we identified 7 areas where we believed, where we still believe the levels of compliance are not what they should be. How we did that, we looked at companies, high net worth or wealthy individuals, and we looked at how often do you submit a tax return, what income do you declare, and is that income consistent with your lifestyle? In other words, with the asset base, how many cars, how many houses, what are the value of those cars and houses? So if you say to me, I earn 1,000 Rand per month, and my salary for the year net is about 12,000 Rand, but I have a 5 million Rand home, there's an inconsistency. So we find these inconsistencies, and those are the 7 areas that we believe we should be looking at more closely. The first one, transfer pricing by large businesses, I'll come back to. Wealthy South Africans and their trusts. Now, Marika can help me, but we find about 2,300 people in this country with annual income, salary of more than 7 million Rand for the year, who have more than 70 million in form of other wealth, shares, share options, monies or income hidden in trusts. Some of them pay very little tax. Some of them have offshore facilities in which money or income is moved because we operate in a global situation, a global environment. If the income tax rate for the individual is 40% in South Africa, and another country has a 15% rate, people move their money there, which is fine. It's permissible in terms of the law. Always say, just declare your income honestly and transparently. Don't try to hide things. Illicit cigarette industry, it's a big problem. Smuggling of cigarettes, clothing and textile. You've seen the kind of job losses that are being reported in the media. Our own competitiveness there with the rest of the world is an issue, but we need to ensure that illicit goods do not come into the country. We are not always successful, but some good work is happening there together with organized labor. And last, the construction industry. Our issue there is, and this is unrelated to the findings of the Competition Commission recently, our issue there is that the construction sector, they're a huge beneficiary of government expenditure. If we want to build roads and stadiums for 2010 and houses, they benefit. So if you benefit from the fiscus on the expenditure side as a construction company, at least ensure that your taxes are in order and that you pay the right amount of tax. Because it's the same tax system that funds your income when you get a government tender to build houses. So we want better compliance there. The findings of these areas are explained in more detail in something called the SARS compliance program. It's available on our website if you want to look at it further. These are the more complex schemes that we find. Now, not many journalists focus on them because they are very, very technical. These are the kind of schemes that highly skilled chartered accountants and tax lawyers who are employed by big corporations. They come up with these things. I'll show you an example now. They market it for big listed companies, how to minimize your tax liability, and we contest many of those things. Now, I've tried to get an example for you. That's a normal loan from a company, by a company from a bank, where you go to the bank to say, I need 120 million rand. I will pay it back to you in 5 years' time. I will pay you 37 million a year for every one of the 5 years. Then I would have paid you 189 million at the end of that period. There's an interest deduction of 69 million. So the bank will be taxed on the 69 million interest it will earn from that transaction. Now for us, that's an arm's length above board, tax neutral transaction. You want to expand your business, you need 120 million. You go to your bank, the bank says, fine, that's the money. Here's the money, these are the terms. You pay it off over the agreed period of time, and we all walk away being happy. The bank pays the tax that it earns on the interest at the end of the situation. This is what happens in the actual marketplace. You can see it's far more complex. So you have a bank, you have a holding company, let's say for argument's sake in South Africa, the holding company has a subsidiary, the subco. There may be a few trusts involved there, which may be in this country or offshore. The bank creates a special purpose vehicle for you to transfer some of the loan offshore. And between the holding company, the subco, and the bank, everyone claims interest from SARS on the debt that they supposedly pay. This is money moving from one pocket to the other pocket. And the smokescreen is created that there's many other pockets where this money is actually used for and it goes to. This is the kind of what we call it structured financing arrangements. It's very complex. So the biggest cases that we end up going to court about would be for issues like this. Most listed companies in this country, being very aware of their public reputation, either settle with SARS or the matter ends up in the tax court and then it's confidential. I think this is the biggest constraint for us when we engage the media. That's one clause in our current tax legislation. It deals with what we call taxpayer confidentiality. Basically, we say the onus is on the taxpayer to fully disclose your income. So when you submit your tax return, you must be transparent, declare all your income, and be honest with us. In turn, we give you an assurance and a guarantee that we will not disclose your information to any unauthorized third parties. And that's why that provision exists in law. What we do find, however, is that many journalists come to us and they want to know, is this politician tax compliant? This company got a tender, do they have a tax clearance? Do they pay their tax? And we can't answer them. Not because we're unwilling, but we have to respect that clause in the law. And that clause applies to all of us. So if a journalist comes to us and wants to know about politician X, we say to them, I don't mind answering you, but you must know I will break the law. And if I break the law here and someone else asks about tax affairs, I must also be allowed to speak about your own levels of compliance. But whenever you see us not commenting and citing taxpayer confidentiality, it's because of this provision in law. And again, it's not because we're trying to be evasive or obstructive, but it's a legal provision that we have to respect. Thank you very much.